Hello, everyone. My name is Natasha Lance, and I'm the Executive Director of Core Operations for the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies, otherwise known as CNS. It is a pleasure to have you here with us this evening. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping details before I hand it over to our evening's host, Dr. Mike Hawley, who is the chair of our CNS Medical Advisory Board. So for those of you who have not joined us for a webinar before, I'll go over the basics. There is in the bottom of your screen a box that says CC. That means closed captioning. If you're in need of closed captioning, click that box, and then you will have captions provided for you. Those of you who are interested in asking questions this evening, and we hope it will be many, please go ahead and use the Q&A function in the bottom of the chat, in the bottom of your screen. You can put your question in there. We're going to batch questions, and then we will ask those at the end. So please use that Q&A feature. Looks like there's already a question in there. As far as how things will go this evening, we will first have our presentation, our discussion, and then after that, we will follow up with Q&A. Before we get going, I want to go over just a few basics about the Center for Nutrition Studies, because some of you are new here. You can also take a look in the chat. We have Dr. Campbell's bio in the chat, the mission statement for CNS, information about the replay, as well as the CNS website. So let me just share my screen quickly here. We'll pop up these slides. So CNS, the Center for Nutrition Studies, we are a 501c3, which means we're a nonprofit. And overall, we're committed to increasing awareness of the extraordinary impact that food has on the health of our bodies, our communities, and our planet. And that is all based on sound science and the education that it provides. Now, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, we are named after him. And this is a very powerful quote from him because this really sums up our nutritional philosophy. I have no doubt that if it were possible to distill the power of nutrition into a single identifiable agent, like a pill or a procedure, then it would receive much more support and representation. I'm sure many of you in tonight's audience would agree with that phrase. Dr. Campbell is also known for coining the term whole food plant-based. I'll bet you some of you didn't know that. And he is also the co-author of the China study. And just to let you know about a few of the free resources that CNS offers. On our website, there are hundreds of articles, recipes, and a whole food plant-based guide. Also, we have an on-demand short program that is free, and it's Whole Food Plant-Based Getting Started. It's a course for those of you who really want to get your feet wet and learn about this lifestyle. We also offer these monthly Spotlight on Health webinars that you're attending right now. And we also have two online communities. These are free resources. One is CNS Kitchen, where you can get personal wellness and culinary support. And then the other is Whole Communities, and that is for plant-based change makers, those who want to take their knowledge and passion of plant-based living to the next level. We do also offer paid programs and courses. So we're probably most known for our plant-based nutrition certificate, but now it's not only offered in English, but also in Spanish and Chinese as well. We offer a food and sustainability certificate that really talks about the connections between our food system and our health. And we also have on-demand cooking courses. And then we have live cook-alongs. We also offer in-depth with the doctor webinars, 3-hour webinars that take a really deep look at very specific diseases, illnesses, and conditions. And then we also offer wellness retreats and cooking retreats. So in a nutshell, very quickly, that's what CNS is all about. This is our website, which I said I dropped in the chat. So please go ahead and check out the resources that we have available. Now, with that being said, I'm going to get off camera. I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Michael Hawley, and he will get us going for the evening. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, Natasha, and welcome everyone to Spotlight on Health, sponsored by the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies. And tonight it is our great privilege to have Dr. Thomas Campbell, MD, who is a physician, best-selling co-author of the China Study, researcher and educator. He's developed groundbreaking clinical and research programs at the University of Rochester, has worked with many hundreds of patients to prevent and treat illness using optimal diet and lifestyle. He is also author the China Study Solution, the practical how-to guide to implement the China Study recommendations, and course co-author of the extremely popular plant-based nutrition certificate offered by the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies. Dr. Campbell attended undergraduate at Cornell University, medical school at the University of Buffalo, and he completed his residency training in family medicine at the University of Rochester. He has published multiple papers in the scientific literature and has presented widely on the topic of plant-based nutrition. He also has completed multiple marathons, and Tom, you have one coming up this summer as well, right?
I do, yeah, in Montana.
Yeah, nice. Well, welcome, Tom. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's going to be a fun night. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics and subjects, so appreciate you being here. So the first one is easy question, Tom. Tell us about your family.
Yeah. Well, I got two boys that are a handful, 8 and 10. And my wife, who is a partner in all things, we collaborate on our work. She's the co-director of our research program with me. So we see a lot of each other, but it works out. So yeah, they're doing well. It's busy times.
Good. Well, thank you for taking time out from your family to talk with us this evening. So to get started, Tom, there may be some in our audience that maybe are new to the plant-based eating and maybe a little confused about, vegetarian and vegan and what is really a true whole food plant-based approach. So help clarify that for us.
Yeah, I think of food as or dietary patterns in terms of two axes. Like if you had a graph, on one axis would be either more animal food or more plant food. I think that's mostly pretty self-explanatory. Are you eating something from a plant or from an animal? The other axis is more complicated, and that's either more processed food or more whole food. When I talk about processing is a complex thing. I mean, frozen food is technically processed, right? When you cook food, you technically process it. So processing is kind of a complicated thing. When I talk about processed food, it's a little different than the standard definition of ultra processed and processed and things they use in research. It's a definition that I borrow from my dad. And it's the idea of food fragments. If you're eating something processed, are you eating a fragment of the original plant? Or are you eating the whole plant? Okay, so olive oil, for example, a lot of people don't consider olive oil terrifically processed, especially cold pressed extra virgin olive oil. But in my mind, I'm thinking it's a very clear example of a highly fragmented food product, right? You're eating olive oil instead of an olive. And when you take the olive and you squish it and you throw out the solids, you're throwing out a lot of nutrition. You're throwing out a lot of stuff that's in those solids. So when I talk about whole food plant-based diet, it's a diet that's whole food, predominantly based on whole foods and plant foods. In practice, what we do in our research when we call something a whole food plant-based, sometimes they say we do a strict whole food plant-based diet where it's vegan, so there's no animal products at all. And no added oils or solid fats, and minimal added sugars and refined flours. So it is a confusing term in the sense of how strict do you have to be and so forth. But we can talk about this more. But I think in our research studies going all the way to sort of a vegan, no animal product diet that's really comprised of whole foods, fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains, and foods, made from those things.
Yeah, great. So, for example, you would consider tofu obviously processed because it's, they changed the form of the soybean, but because it's not a food fragment per se, it's just soybeans, that's a minimally processed plant-based food. How would you?
Yeah, and there's gradations within that too, of course. I
Yeah,
mean, tofu is a food fragment. I mean, that you throw away the fiber and so forth, you lose some fiber, but you can get tempeh. That's actually the whole soybean that's fermented, which is truly more of a whole food. So, and the same thing with flour products. If you have 100% whole grain flour product, even though it's been ground up, that's processing. I think of that as close enough to a whole food. So whole, whole grain flour as a whole food. So yeah, and I don't recommend or discuss or talk about a whole food in a very concrete, strict way, because tofu can be part of the diet. In my interpretation of the diet, that's not 100% whole food. But if you get like soy curls, I don't know if anybody's ever tried soy curls. I
oh,
recommend
sure.
them.
Sure.
And those actually, somewhat miraculously, I don't know how they do it, but those are the whole soybean that they've somehow dehydrated and formulated and put, smushed together to make you make
Right.
these things that are wonderful in recipes. So yeah, it's really that processing part that gets most confusing, I think. And how much of this can you have? How much of that can you have? And it can get a little tricky, but unfortunately, there's so many different food products. It's hard to come up with a clearer way to describe it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you've made it very clear. It's get close to the whole food as possible with, like you said, a few little minor exceptions. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
that's helpful. Thank you, Tom.
right. Yeah.
So this may be a difficult question, so I'll give you some leeway and you can maybe talk about more than one single factor, but what is the most important single factor in health benefits from a plant-based diet?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have learned a lot from the patients I've worked with over the years. I mean, they've been incredible teachers in my journey. And one of the things I've learned, and it's not something I would have necessarily come to at the beginning of my journey after working on the China study and reading a bunch of nutrition stuff, is that you can get quite a lot healthier just by eating less food, right? It
Yeah,
doesn't need to be particularly good food. Um, you can get lower cholesterol, lower blood pressure, lower weight, lower blood sugar, all sorts of metabolic benefits simply by eating less food. And even if it's some Twinkies and some cheeseburgers and whatever. And so when I think about the effective diet, and when we're trying to improve our diet and work on our diet, I think the single biggest factor is calorie intake, is how much you're eating. Now, that being said, don't let that be justification to go eat a bunch of junk and just say, oh, it's a little bit. That being said, is that it does matter. There are other factors, is what I'm saying. So it's not just calorie count. You can take you
sure.
can take two diets that have quite different food composition, one being a whole food plant based and one being, I don't know, a standard American diet. If they both have 1,800 calories, there are going to be different health outcomes from those diets. The whole food plant based has way more fiber, way less saturated fat, way less fat, and on and on and on. Many more antioxidants, more anti-inflammatory stuff. So there are many other things that matter, and there are many reasons to choose healthier food. But I think if you boiled it down to the single biggest factor, I think is probably calorie intake. And this is useful because if you think about a whole food plant-based diet, there's a lot of recipes out there that are whole food plant-based, but they're pretty high calorie. And you do whole food plant-based for long enough, you're going to find these pretty quickly, and get used to making them. and have them. And you can have a pretty high calorie diet with whole food plant-based diet. And if you're not, if you carry an extra weight and you want to lose some weight, but the scale isn't budging, for example, you're not going to get the whole benefit of the whole food plant-based diet, because probably you're not getting the full benefit of that calorie piece, which in my experience and my learning from people and my research and so forth, that calorie piece is probably the single biggest factor. So yeah, it's an important thing.
Yeah, great. So on that same vein, what have you experienced with your patients and research? What is most difficult for people to do with this diet? I mean, what troubles do you see, roadblocks or potholes that patients go through when they're attempting to eat better, eat whole food plant-based?
Yeah, it's when I first started, I thought, gosh, how hard is it to eat oatmeal? But the barriers are many, and for many people, it's taste, right? I mean, it's easy to forget. So I didn't grow up whole food plant-based, and my favorite food was sausage patties and for breakfast, and a white bread, toasted with mayonnaise and scrambled eggs for sandwich for tons of sweets and so forth. If my mom's listening, she was a wonderful mom. But
We love you, Karen.
but so I didn't eat this way, but I did transition slowly with the family to more. We always had fruits and vegetables and so forth. But there's a lot of people who grow up who don't have any vegetables. We're now a few generations into folks who didn't have sort of a lot of home cooked food. And when you haven't been eating vegetables and or fruits for that matter, the taste can be a big barrier. I mean, there's things that I've learned, again, learning from people. There's things that I've tried as like, oh, everybody's going to like this. This is absolutely amazing. It's delicious. And some of those things do cross over and reach some more people, but man, I'll tell you, if you've been eating Big Macs and sodas and whatever, it's very hard to find food that's not loaded with salt, sugar, and fat that tastes right. So the taste is just, it's that pleasure trap, as Doug Lyle, those people listening, if you do a Google search, put that in there, Natasha, the Doug Lyle and the pleasure trap. It's worth a Google search. He has a great TED talk, and it's hard to change your tastes. They do change, but what happens is that people start changing their diet, and it's kind of miserable for them. They don't like the food. The other thing is a relationship with food. Food has become a drug for so many. So for so many of us, in the sense that when we eat food, we are expecting pleasure. The pleasure that would be a sort of a mild form of like a drug. And when you eat a whole food plant-based food, it's wonderful, it's tasty, it's nourishing, but it doesn't necessarily have the same woo. It's not the same thing as an ice cream at the ice cream shop. And so they start changing their diet, and they feel kind of like they've lost their pleasure, they've lost their friend. And it's in the first few weeks to the month or so, and they kind of think, I'm motivated. They go in, they try it, and they start thinking, but wait a minute, after a few weeks, I don't want to live the rest of my life this way. This was my main source of pleasure. This is what I did to relax and enjoy myself on the weekend. I don't want to give up that relaxation and pleasure. Like, I'd rather die sooner. You've heard that before. I'd rather live happier and die sooner than live the crazy way Campbell's trying to get me to eat. But they don't realize, so they think that first few weeks of changing your diet, it's going to be that way forever. That's the body responds that way. Food doesn't taste as good. It's less pleasurable. And it's like, this guy's asking me to do this for the rest of my life. No, sorry. I'll take the pill. I'll take my cholesterol pill and hope for the best. And what they don't realize is that, if you just stick with it for a few months, your taste really changes. So there's taste. There's people who haven't really ever cooked very much, prepared their own food. And so, there's relationship issues. That's a very common one, where people may be motivated to change their diet themselves, but my goodness, if their spouse is, berating them or getting after them or won't cook their food, won't eat their food, whatever, that can be a huge, huge barrier. So there's so many things that can make it hard to change. But changing behavior is tough. It's hard. It turns out that eating oatmeal can be kind of difficult to make a habit of it.
Yeah, yeah. All that is very true, Tom. And it's been my experience. We've had some skeptical people attend our CNS retreats, and they start realizing this food is really pretty good when it's prepared right.
Right.
And they often leave saying, "Wow, this is great. The food was good," and they kind of have their taste buds changed in that week, and they leave with a really better outlook on the whole food plant-based as well. And also some of the cooking retreats have been successful as well. So there's lots of ways to kind of break people into this approach.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I always like to do events where we give people food because
Yeah.
people have to realize, I don't know about a lot of people, their experience and expectation of vegetable is that it's like going through the cafeteria, you get a lumpy pile of, overcooked peas and carrots or something. It's like, wait, you're supposed to eat that for the rest of my life, So the food is really critical.
Yeah, exactly. So, Tom, no discussion on plant-based nutrition would be complete without talking about the P word, protein. Tell us about plant-based protein, and should we be worried about this? Should we be counting grams of protein and likewise fat and carbohydrate? What's your opinion on that? How do you advise patients?
Yeah, this is the current trend in nutrition. I would say the pop culture nutrition voices. It's really protein, protein, protein. It's been this incredibly strong emphasis on getting sufficient protein. And we just did a little group in my clinic, physicians did a little journal club on just this question because it's become such a thing. A lot of the protein, and I could go on and on forever, so I'll try to keep it brief, but a lot of if you've been attuned to some other popular nutrition authors or podcasts or new social media nutrition or whatever, a lot of the protein mania right now is based on this argument that higher protein intake has been linked to higher lean body mass in older adults or in compromised people, like people with cancer. And the second bit of information is that people with lower lean body mass or lower strength oftentimes have worse outcomes, whether it's mortality or function, frailty, sarcopenia, which is a term of losing that muscle mass, that frailty. So those two things, higher protein intake has been linked to higher lean body mass and muscle mass in older adults or compromised populations. And the fact that lower muscle mass is linked to worse outcomes has fueled a protein craze. I would actually kind of call it a craze. I mean, there's a book, I can't remember the name of it. It's is it Outlive? It's Peter Attia's book that recommends like 1 gram. I hope I'm not getting this wrong. 1 gram of protein per pound per day. That's, so the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance is about daily intake is about 0.8 grams per kilogram. 1 gram per pound per day.
Like double.
Way higher.
Yeah.
Way higher. And there's a long history of this, right? I mean, I encourage people to read The Future of Nutrition if you haven't, from my dad. There's a long history of this protein mania because protein has always equaled meat, right? It's always been meat. And I mean, even now we hear about the language of ordering food or a menu or a recipe or whatever. People still say, choose your protein, or as if it's okay. It's not. You're not eating food. You're eating a macronutrient.
Right.
Which drives me kind of crazy. But So there's a long history of people being drawn to this idea. We have a bias to like messages where it's more meat, more meat, more meat. And so this idea is very, very appealing to us. And it is true, this muscle mass story, there's research behind it. But it's not as clear, but then you get into the nuances of this research, and it's not nearly as clear as they would have you believe in terms of higher protein intake actually being linked to better physical function over time. There's a lot of limitations in this observational research. Some of the research contradicts some of those assumptions and findings. And then apart from the muscle mass issue, which people are crazy about, which is really a physical activity discussion, by the way, it's really about physical activity,
Right.
not food to begin with. But apart from all of that, people seem to have forgotten like heart disease. What about heart disease, our number one killer, cardiovascular disease? What about this thing called cancer? What about diabetes? What about other metabolic disease? And it turns out that if you're talking about protein recommendations for these chronic diseases, it's more clear. You're not just talking about lean body mass. You're talking about these chronic diseases. The risk of harm is usually in consuming too much protein, high protein diets. Kidney disease, heart disease. The risk of harm is oftentimes the harms are associated with the higher protein intake. So there's a lot of scientific kind of myopia when people talk about this in recent times. They're really focused on this frailty, muscle mass thing, and they're forgetting about heart disease, cancer, diabetes, kidney disease, et cetera. And it's just good news about our bad habits, as Dr. McDougall used to say. It's reinforcing this idea that have a meat at every meal, because it's hard to get 1 gram per pound per day without absolutely loading yourself with lean meat or low fat dairy. So it's good news about our bad habits, and it's reinforcing kind of a low carb idea. Now, all of that being said, and I'm sorry being so long-winded here, all of that being said, there are 2 situations where people can run into problems, I think, getting sufficient protein and micronutrients like other things like calcium. And that is someone who is an older adult who's eating, appetite has come down, and their calorie intake is really quite low. If your calorie intake is really quite low, you're just not eating very much, very little compared to how you used to eat. If you're eating 1,200 calories or something a day, and that seems to fill you up, you can be low in lots of things. That's just not much food. And then, so you can have insufficient intake of protein in that situation. The other circumstances, people in weight loss who it's very hard to lose weight. If you have to restrict your diet pretty severely, your calorie intake also may be very low. And in those situations, I do recommend kind of being mindful and intentional about those micronutrients and like calcium and protein. So there may be situations, for example, where having a protein shake, I know this is going to maybe make people angry because it's definitely not whole food plant-based, but using a plant-based protein shake as a supplement in some of these uncommon and unusual circumstances where calorie intake is otherwise very low.
Okay. So, Tom, if I'm a person that's considering plant-based, or maybe I'm on plant-based right now, what would you advise as far as my protein intake? I'm 67 years old. So if you're in your 60s, 70s, what do you advise people for protein intake in the plant-based world?
Yeah, so I don't recommend counting. I don't think people need to worry or obsess about it that much. But if you're a community dwelling adult, meaning you live in the community, you're living an active kind of normal life, you're doing some physical activity, you're able to do physical activity, you go out shopping, do work, whatever, you're probably getting enough food. Your dietary intake is probably sufficient so that food can cover all your protein needs. So don't worry too much about the protein. The exception would be if you are doing a weight loss, you're really trying to lose weight and you have to restrict your food quite a bit to lose weight. or if you have some sort of medical condition where your intake goes way down. If it's chemotherapy or something in cancer, if your intake goes way down, that's cancer. That's a whole separate. Let me erase that because there's a whole separate conversation about that, and low protein diets maybe being interesting and helpful. But so if you're a community dwelling adult living sort of a normal active life, just choose foods whole foods, and largely it'll take care of itself. I mean, I do think beans, everybody should be having beans every single day. Tofu, plain tofu is great. And I do think if you're doing a non-dairy milk, I do suggest people do a non-dairy milk, which some people don't if they don't have breakfast or don't eat cereal. But I think a non-dairy milk, and particularly if you have no problems with soy, have a soy milk. If you have a couple glasses of soy milk and you have regular food with beans every day, you're getting more than enough protein. Yeah. You don't need to think twice about it.
Good. So what I'm hearing you say is if I'm consuming adequate calories, balanced beans, some soy, some whole grains, I'm going to get all the protein I need. I don't have to count every gram of protein and say, oh, how many grams did I get today? What percent? It's balanced diet, adequate calories.
Absolutely. And if you have been listening to this whole protein thing in this protein craze and kind of getting wrapped up and worried about it, the thing to do about that and to address that is physical activity. So add some resistance work to your, if you're not using your muscles and your bones, they're going to suffer. I don't care what you're eating. So add a little bit of weightlifting. It can be gentle. It doesn't need, you don't need to do, it's not bodybuilding, grunting kind of stuff, gentle weightlifting circuit sort of thing at your gym. Do a little bit of cardio workout, some walking, can be light. Those things are really important as we age, and not just the walking, but adding in a little bit of resistance work. Even as we age, a little bit of balance work, or what we call proprioception, balancing our body, being able to coordinate and balance our body. Those things are critical. And so if you're worried about frailty, aging well, being functional into your later years, that is really the cornerstone, is that physical activity, and doing it in a safe way, but in a demanding way where you're using your muscles and bones regularly.
Yeah, excellent. Great advice, Tom. Tom, we've heard a lot about oil recently in the nutrition world. What is your take, and what should we be doing in regards to oil?
Yeah, so I just became aware of like an oil debate or something on Forks Over Knives, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The real conundrum with nutrition is that there's one of the great rationalizations in our brain just kind of floating there, waiting to pop up at any moment, is this little bit won't hurt, right? Whether it's whatever your favorite indulgent, this little bit won't hurt. And that's the reason that's such a wonderful, fantastic rationalization that our brain likes to pull out whenever it can is because it's true. If you have an absolutely perfect diet, right, and you have a little bit of oil, you put a little spoonful of oil in your diet, everything else is 100% perfect. The odds of that actually hurting you, I think it changes your risks very little, for or against any particular risk that you're thinking about. Here's the problem with that, is that it's a behavioral question in my mind. It goes back to this, well, first of all, from a nutritional point of view, with any particular food, if you're asking about a specific food, you always have to ask, nutrition is always relative. So if you're asking about the healthfulness of oil, it's, what oil instead of what, in place of what? Yeah. Then you can talk about the health benefit of oil. And then also the second question is not only instead of what, but with what are you having the oil? And that's where you begin to understand a little bit about the health effects. So if you're talking about olive oil instead of, some day old French fry grease, olive oil is great. It's wonderful, very healthy. If you're talking about olive oil instead of an olive or broccoli, give me the whole food any day of the week. But yeah, it's the problem is that it's a behavioral question, and this little bit won't hurt. Is that one of our first things we did in my lifestyle medicine when I really sort of started doing this as part of my job as a doctor, we started, my wife and I started a group in a primary care setting where we had an intensive group program for 8 weeks, met with people every couple of weeks, and taught them a whole food plant-based diet, and had tracking and all sorts of behavioral support, and fed them, and et cetera, et cetera. And the people who came to me in the beginning were oftentimes people who had heard of me from the plant-based world. Not a big surprise. So they heard of me and they came in to see me for the initial consult to learn about the program. And they said, well, I'm already vegan. I'm already vegetarian. I'm already plant-based. I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. And I'd ask them 24-hour food recall, what did you have for breakfast? What did you have for lunch? What did you have for dinner? And they were eating much better than the average American. But they had already lost maybe 30 pounds, but they wanted to lose 20 more. They had dropped their cholesterol a little bit, but they were still being pushed to be on a statin, and they didn't want to go on a statin, so they wanted a little bit more. And so I saw these people and I was like, oh man, I'm only getting the toughest people. They're already eating really well, and they want more benefit. And I started out this journey. It's like, well, how much benefit am I going to see when these people do a whole food plant-based diet? And one of the most, teaching kind of experiences with me early on in this lifestyle medicine journey I've had is working with those very same people who were eating well. But when they joined the program, I said, okay, you joined the program, but you're 100% strict. And I want you no added oil in anything, no salad dressing, no cracker, no snacks of any of that garbage in the house. You got to get it out of the house. You got to be 100% vegan, 100% vegan. Your favorite egg that you might have in the context of a vegetarian diet, you can't do it over the next 8 weeks. And many of them did it. They paid money, they did it. And one of the things that experience taught me is that even in the context of a healthful vegetarian or vegan diet, the people who got strict had remarkably big benefits. I mean, their benefits were almost as big as if they were eating a typical omnivore diet. And so I thought, and that started this sort of intellectual kind of process for me, like, well, what the heck is going on? And through my experience, one of the interesting things that I've always kind of thought about is why do we do the things we do, and what's the barriers? What are the kind of mental things? And I think what's going on is that even if you're eating a largely healthful diet, it's really, really easy to start rationalizing a bunch of stuff that you shouldn't be eating. And when you ask about oil, you start adding a spoonful of oil, or it's that non-fat spray.
Yeah.
It's nothing. That little bit won't hurt. Well, there's going to be something at the next meal that you don't have very much. That's just a little bit. Or maybe you'll go out to eat the next day and have kind of the rich entree that you don't go out very much. You don't go to that restaurant very much. And I think what happens is we do have these little indulgences very regularly, and each one may be very little and infrequent. But my goodness, if you have a little indulgence every day, for a lot of people, that's enough to their benefits. Stop it right in place. So I'm very kind to people, but I've realized that, and I understand how difficult it is to change habits. But boy, I've gotten some good lessons in the fact that, in having some indulgences can really derail your efforts. And so I do think being strict, avoiding the added oils is a good thing if you're trying to reverse or treat disease. If you're trying to reverse or treat disease, if you're a young person who is healthy, super active, you could question certainly being so super strict. But if your back is against the wall, you want to maximize your health benefit. I think being very strict has some benefits.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I've experienced the same, Tom. Patients come to me and say, I've been doing everything right and I haven't lost the weight I want, or my lipid profile's not what I wanted. Each time when they do a 24 or 7-day recall diet, there's all these indulgences that you're talking about. So
Yes.
there's usually a reason. But kind of piggybacking on that, what about those that are truly following a whole food plant-based diet, no added oils, and still maybe their lipid profiles are not optimal? Should these people consider statins? And when do you recommend statins for those on whole food plant-based diets?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I'm what I call myself an all of the above doctor, and
Hmm.
meaning that I'm my passion and love is lifestyle and being healthy on your own with physical activity and good nutrition and sleep and so forth. But that doesn't cure everything. That doesn't fix everything. It's not going to prevent everything. There's no question about that. Um, and so sometimes there are people with just incredibly strong genetic predispositions that absolutely, high cholesterol, early heart disease in their family. I'm all of the above. Do everything you can to lower your risk, including medications.
Yeah.
So, it depends on an individual's history, their numbers, and so forth. But I'm generally not a big fan if there's evidence of benefit from a medication. I'm not a fan of using nutrition in place of it. I think go ahead and do both. And quite frankly, the medicine I think of as the this may be a nuance that people don't appreciate. I think of medicine oftentimes as the adjunctive treatment. The treatment is still the food, but if food isn't getting you 100% of the way and you really are being very, very strict, go ahead and add the medicine as well. There is benefit to these things. The benefit is smaller than patients and doctors generally think, but there is benefit.
Yeah.
And so I say do all of the above.
Yeah. I think that's sound advice. Yeah. With your patients, do you follow inflammatory markers for their cardiovascular disease status, or is that part of your program?
So I only follow inflammatory markers in certain situations if and I don't necessarily even follow them per se. I like to not do too much testing. Testing sometimes doesn't clarify things. It raises more questions than it clarifies. But I like to test inflammatory markers if the risk is sort of intermediate, if they have an intermediate risk. So if you look at your 10-year sort of risk calculator, if people have gone to their doctor, you've seen this thing where you can put in your factors, blood pressure, cholesterol, age, presence of diabetes, treatment, and so forth. And it gives you a risk of 10 years, whether you have a risk of heart attack or stroke or death from one of these things. And in those situations where people have an intermediate risk, meaning that it's not low risk, it's not high risk, and you're kind of on the fence, what do you do? Then some extra testing can be useful. And so that in that case, I will follow inflammatory markers or check them at least. But generally, I don't test them in a general population. If everything else is sort of generally low risk.
In line. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Very
hard to
good.
know with inflammatory markers exactly what it's from.
Right.
You can have higher inflammatory markers just from some extra weight.
Yeah.
So obesity can cause higher inflammatory markers. You can have some joint issues. Do you have a touch of autoimmune stuff? Do you have these things? And it gets really hard to know exactly what's what. So if you're otherwise healthy and not particularly high risk, and you wouldn't be considering medication or anything otherwise, I don't see a point in
Okay.
tracking everything.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. So, Tom, what about water fasting? What are the benefits of water fasting?
This is outside my wheelhouse. I'm not a fasting expert at all. I am familiar, of course, with True North Health Clinic. That can go in the chat, Natasha. But True North Health Clinic, those guys are probably the world's experts in water only fasting, and long duration water only fasting. I do think that people need to be very careful with water only fasting if they're on medication in particular or any chronic disease. I mean, you start doing water only fasting with some heavy medications and you're going to, playing with fire a little bit
Yeah.
in terms of, so it's not something you can do at home when you're taking a bunch of meds. You got to be pretty careful with it. And but that being said, I think it's clear that there's some major health benefits from fasting. Uh, and whether there's all sorts of different fasting protocols, and whether it's a 5-day sort of lower calorie but not water only fasting, there's been demonstrated benefits from that type of thing. But water only fasting as well. I mean, they published with my dad. They published a wonderful paper on controlling blood pressure, on treating high blood pressure, refractory blood pressure with water only fasting. The key, of course, one of the keys is following that fast with adopting a healthy diet, a whole
Exactly.
food plant-based diet. I mean, it's the same thing kind of with probiotics, by the way. If you're doing something wonderful with a fast and then you fly away from the fasting place and you start eating Big Macs, you know, just kind of wasted your time.
Yeah. 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 Definitely benefits, but definitely needs to be supervised and by a physician and somebody is experienced in water fasting.
That's right.
Yeah. So a lot of people struggle with weight management, achieving the optimal weight. What are the advantages of plant-based eating in regards to losing weight and maintaining a healthy weight?
Yeah, so I'm an obesity medicine physician. I'm certified, so I spend a lot of time talking about weight management with people. The key concept here is calorie density. It's on it's funny, you kind of assume that people kind of know basically what's healthy and what's not, but I'll tell you, when I talk about people trying to decide how to target their food changes, it's all over the map in terms of people not knowing exactly how to change. So it's really important to get familiar with the idea of calorie density. And above, if I have this little handout where on the top, the lowest calorie density is vegetables, non-starchy vegetables. And then below that is fruits. And then whole fruits, not dried fruits, whole fruits. And then below that is starchy, healthy starchy plants, cooked, healthy starchy plants. And so, if you have vegetables, they're so low calorie density, you can eat a million of them and you could never fill up. I mean, they're very, very healthy, eat a ton of them, but they provide very little energy. Fruits have a little bit more energy, wonderful as snacks, but it's hard. It's possible, but it is kind of hard to overdo calories with fruits. It's possible. And then you have the healthy starches, which really fill you up. So a pound of rice and beans is like 500 calories. So here's the thing with weight management. You have to eat different foods so that you can be full on fewer calories. One of the most predominant weight management strategies of my entire lifetime, if you go back research way before I was in medicine, is just simply eating less. It's calorie restriction. And most weight management programs are versions of calorie restriction programs. And those can be successful for a small percentage of people. I don't know what happens, but they just somehow, they were overeating most of their life and somehow they actually truly are full on, 40% fewer calories. But that's pretty darn rare. Even
Very rare.
among motivated people, dieters, I mean, you're talking about low single digits of people who can just sort of eat less and eat the same kind of diet, but just eat less and succeed in the long run. That's a pretty rare bird who can do that. You really got to change what you're eating. And I think if you get strict with calorie density, cutting out the nut sauces, cutting out the oils, cutting out dried fruits, those sugars, those sweetness, the fat, cutting out sometimes the flour products, the crackers, the cereals. Often usually have salt, kind of salty snacks. Cutting out all those things strictly. What people find is that they eat more food and they consume far fewer calories, and it gets much easier without having to starve themselves. Now that it sounds easy and nice, but the tricky thing is that those foods don't provide a drug-like effect. We sit down with a bag of potato chips at night because it's a little bit of a drug. And you can sit down with some baby carrots and some frozen grapes or something and at night, and it's nice. It's nice. You get a little crunch, you get the sweetness. It's not a drug. And so then, but you really run into the pleasure trap, when you're trying to do that. But if you can do it, that's, I think, the way to do it. And there's research that suggests that, our hunger hormones and so forth, if you're eating a lower calorie density diet, your hunger hormones are more in control over the long run. So you're not fighting biology. So that calorie density is critical. And another thing to put in the chat, Natasha, is I asked people to watch Jeff Novick's YouTube lecture. If you Jeff Novick, calorie density, has a great 1-hour lecture on YouTube. Yes. To really target. You have to know how to target your dietary changes. And it sounds simple, but most people are a little off target.
Yeah. Yeah, he does a great job with calorie density, makes it very clear and with some humor as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. So Tom, our time is down to about 7 minutes. I have many more questions that I'm not going to be able to ask you, but there are a couple I want to touch on, and so save time for maybe 2 more questions, all right?
Okay.
All right. So just touch briefly on the world of supplements. What do you recommend for anybody on a plant-based diet as far as supplements?
So I do recommend a multivitamin. I know there's, you got to get your B12 for sure. Vitamin D if you're living particularly in the northern half of the US. But then even then, if people are eating, I've encountered enough people who, they're just starting out. They don't want to sit there and plan their diet super well. So they may not be getting enough calcium because they're not doing non-dairy milk. So I've gone to, iodine is really present in like seaweed. Yep. So, if you're not doing super well planned kind of diet, I think a multivitamin kind of covers your basis, and you miss the risks that are associated with, like a Centrum, for example. You miss the risks of these mega dose isolated vitamins. Like it's hard to find isolated B12, for example, that doesn't come in these very large doses. So a multivitamin generally has kind of just normal range amounts of these things, and it's not going to prevent cancer. It's not going to prevent heart disease. It's not going to make you healthy. It's just going to prevent your bases if you don't have like a meticulously planned whole food plant-based diet. You might not be eating very much or whatever. So I do recommend a multivitamin, but that's about it as a blanket approach. I mentioned before very uncommon circumstances where people have very restrictive diets for weight loss, or older adults who have very low calorie intake. Situations very low calorie intake, I may consider other things like a protein supplement.
Okay, so daily multivitamin, perhaps some vitamin D, and otherwise you're going to get what you need.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. So you do a lot of nutrition research, and I wanted you to talk about the importance and particularly the difficulty in doing nutrition research, and also about association versus causation in nutrition research, because that's important too.
Do you want me to leave time for another question?
No, that's it.
I'll be talking here for the rest of the night with that one.
I know, but you have a good 5 to 6 minutes, so go for it.
So yeah, nutrition research is very difficult. It's interesting. Talking with a guy who is a researcher, and you don't need to know the backstory. Talking with a guy who does nutrition research and cancer. But as nutrition research is all bench work, it's all preclinical bench work, and it's trying to understand nutritional pathways involved in cancer promotion, progression, metastasis, et cetera. So trying to understand these pathways, and I had a chance to talk with them because we did a nutrition study in cancer. And so we think, oh, yeah, some stuff to talk about, But, I made reference to the idea it's very hard to get funding for clinical nutrition research. Very, very hard. It's outside of the mainstream. People kind of wonder what the heck you're doing. Why are you taking cancer patients and changing their diet? Blah, 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 blah. They're totally uneducated about plant-based nutrition. A lot of misconceptions. It's way too expensive for people to do. Nobody can follow that. All this kind of bias that people have who aren't familiar with any of this. It's very hard to get people to buy in. And I sort of referenced some of that atmosphere, and he kind of looked curious. He's like, "Well, wait, what do you? Actually, there's a lot of money. They love this nutrition work, in my experience." And I kind of think, well, you know what? Your nutrition work is really actually to identify targets for a drug that can be developed. If you can find a nutritional enzyme in there somewhere on a pathway that controls cancer cell promotion or whatever, that enzyme can then be, you design a drug to target that enzyme. And, it's drug discovery, not nutrition work, it's drug discovery. So clinical nutrition work, if you're doing nutrition work that doubles as drug discovery, I suppose times can be good. But if you're doing clinical nutrition work where you're taking patients and you're looking at nutrition as treatment, nutrition as medicine, it's still way outside the mainstream. And people sometimes don't really believe that, but because from a patient point of view, patients care about. There's a lot of patients that care about this, particularly when you get to something where your back is against the wall. You get diagnosed with breast cancer. You get diagnosed with serious heart disease. You're back against the wall. You have that visceral, palpable feeling. I lose my health. I lose everything, right? And suddenly the idea of changing your diet doesn't seem out of bounds. So there's plenty of people who are interested in nutrition from the patient side, in certain cohorts and certain groups of people. But in the research side and the researcher side, it's like far out there. It's fringe. Not many people are doing it, and so we have a system where the funding and funding decisions, what questions you ask, how you ask those questions, how you answer those questions, how you design your studies. It's all peer reviewed. It all has to be approved by people who have succeeded in the status quo. And so it really is an uphill fight. It's a really uphill battle. So doing nutrition research is very, very difficult. And one of the reasons we've been able to do ours, well, not one of, the reason, because we've received philanthropic donations to the U of R. So Center for Nutrition Studies, Ladybug Foundation, many individual donors have donated money to the U of R for nutrition research. They're not involved in the research at all, the organizations, but they've donated money for nutrition research, and so we've been able to use that. So yeah, nutrition research it's tremendously exciting. I think it's very patient oriented, and it has an opportunity to help a lot of people, but it's still far outside the mainstream. I mean, way far out. Hard to get funding, and it's getting, obviously with the new administration, it's about to take a bad situation and make it catastrophically worse. With science funding, but so it's difficult. And then you also asked another question. Now I've talked myself so much.
That's okay. Yeah, association versus
association causation. Yeah, it's really people on every side of the spectrum can kind of confuse it, and sometimes you confuse it a bit intentionally to make your point. If the point agrees with what you're trying to say, right. But yeah, the perfect example is this thing of like the muscle mass thing I referenced earlier with protein. It is true that if you look at all across older adults, those adults eating more protein, higher protein diets have more muscle mass, have more lean body mass. And in some measures of physical function, they have higher scores on physical function, not just mass, but physical function. So that's an association. So higher protein intake, physical function, and muscle mass. But then you think, oh man, that's not exactly causation. If you look at a cohort of people age 70 to 90, I mean, you know this, of course, and I think most people know this. There is a huge range of ability and function. That's the most variable age range. You can have an 85-year-old still running half marathons, or, of course, someone in a nursing home. You have this huge range of function and activity for all sorts of other reasons: chronic diseases, heritable, genetics, previous lifestyle exposures, etc. You can have a huge range. And so is it possible that the people who are active and have more muscle mass and have more physical activity and function are eating more calories and therefore have more protein intake? Is the physical activity and muscle mass leading to more protein, or is the protein leading to more muscle mass? Now, there's other ways to answer that question. Probably it's some of both, but because then you start looking at other research and realize, wait a minute, there's some conflicting research. So this association and causation stuff is really critical. It's difficult to tease out. One of the problems with nutrition research is that so much of it is observational. And observational research is wonderful. It's necessary and critical. We can learn a lot from observational research, but to really put it to the test, you have to intervene. You have to do an intervention with people. And that's where the research world has really fallen on its face, because the system has not prioritized or wanted to do that type of research. It's expensive. People who sitting on these review committees have a ton of their own biases. They have a ton of their ignorance, that they don't know much about nutrition because there's hardly much clinical nutrition people out there. So it's the association causation thing, unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with, because we have to make, people want to make nutrition recommendations based on this observational research, but you have to be comfortable saying, I don't really know for sure.
Yeah, that's fair.
Which,
that's fair.
if you're looking at, if you're looking at nutrition information, I mean, my God, this crap on social media, for example, is just the most crazy nonsense out there. But the average person, how do you know? I mean, this person is a doctor. They sound super, super confident. They know what they're talking about. They have all these super specific recommendations. Sounds great. They have great credentials. Why would they listen to me instead of them? I don't know. I don't know. You could be a very, very smart person,
Yeah.
and not know who to listen to. So unfortunately, though, that association causation thing, we're a bit stuck with.
Sure. I mean, Center for Nutrition Studies is a reliable science-based source for information to kind of help clear up some of that confusion. And it's easy to do easier, I should say, to do a pharmaceutical, study, because you either get the medication or they don't. With nutrition, you have to control what they eat. Three meals a day for a long period of time. So as you know, because you've done all this, you have to provide food, and it becomes very expensive and complicated. But you've done some excellent studies on cancer and diabetes with outstanding results. I mean, convincing results.
Yeah. It's been wonderful. You're absolutely right. The small studies that we've done are logistically kind of, it's very funny. There is a new sort of research policy that came out, like, I don't know, a couple of years ago, where there is certain documentation requirement where the study coordinator, research coordinator, who often does a lot of these other studies and does a lot of parts of our study, the research coordinator has to, in this new policy, had to have a signed document that they met with the principal investigator at least once a month to discuss the study. And that may sound kind of crazy, but if you're doing a drug trial where it's a placebo-controlled drug trial and the research coordinator is responsible for recruiting people and doing all the process of distributing the drugs and so forth, the investigator, person who came up with the protocol and the questions and so forth, the investigator can sort of be hands off for a long time.
Yeah.
And I don't think, doing this nutrition research and meeting with people every week and like doing education and support and all this food provision and menu planning and educate, it's like the total other end of the spectrum where we do these small studies, but my God, logistically they're very, very demanding. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of a different ball of wax, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Tom, this has been absolutely wonderful to this evening. Thank you so much. We're going to, just before you come on, Natasha, come back, and she has some questions for you from the audience. But I'll remind our audience, if you go back to previous Spotlight on Health, Tom did a Spotlight on Health last year, I don't know, spring, early summer, on his research on cancer and diabetes and nutrition. So that's a good watch. Go back and review that one. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend it highly. He talks about his new research, the results, and some of the difficulties. So good one to look at. Natasha, are you there? There you are.
I am here. I was trying to drop in the chat really quickly that webinar link that you just mentioned.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So there you go. It's there. All right.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'm sorry we ran over a little bit, but I had an outstanding guest today, and we just need to talk a little bit more.
Well, you did. And I have outstanding questions in the Q&A. So,
Okay, good
Mr.
for it.
Campbell, are you ready for rapid fire responses here?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So you were just talking about your breast cancer study and some of the studies you've done before. Really quickly, the link that I mentioned to you before we started this webinar, if I send that in the replay email, is that going to give people results and information about the breast cancer study on
Yeah, I
that?
think most of the publications that are published, there's some in process, but are
Yeah.
going to be on that page.
Okay, great. Someone did ask for that, and I just wanted to make sure that that would be there. Thank you so much. So we have some food-related questions, and then we have more medical-related questions. We're going to jump in with a medical-related question. This is from another physician. On your discussion of protein intake, please comment on insufficient calorie intake leading to gluconeogenesis with subsequent sarcopenia. That is, by avoiding carbs with insufficient carbohydrate conversion to glucose, the body starts to utilize protein as a fuel source, leading to muscle loss. Could you address that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting if you look at fasting, for example, or even time restricted eating, which people call intermittent fasting, where you go long stretches without eating. Some of the findings actually show that there is some lean body mass loss if you go long stretches without eating, and for this probably this reason, when you stop taking in food, your body will kind of consume itself, for lack of a better so there's a lot of science there, breaking down the catabolic, breaking down a muscle and so forth, and gluconeogenesis for energy. So, you can do fine fasting and have energy, and there's some major health benefits, but you can have some muscle wasting and loss in a particular way. I think if you go for pretty long stretches with very restricted calorie intake. Now, that being said, if it's not a permanent state, if it's not a permanent situation, do you get that back? I'm not aware of any particular research related to that, but looking at that rebound. But I mean, theoretically, I don't see why you couldn't, do some physical activity, lift weights, and eat a full healthy diet, non-calorie restricted diet, and sort of get that back. So I don't think it's a reason to avoid calorie, whether it's fasting or whatever, but it is something to be aware of. I think when people are doing these stretches of time with no calorie intake, that there can be some excess or extra lean body mass loss or muscle loss. Not so rapid fire, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. Trying to be kind to everyone and get as many questions as we can here. You just mentioned non-calorie restriction eating. So there are several questions this evening from people who you, as an obesity medicine specialist, you're usually working with people who are trying to shed weight. But what about those who are desperately trying to gain weight? Can you speak to that at all? Like
Yes.
trying to be whole food, plant-based, what can they do?
Yeah, so I really push the higher calorie plant foods, whole plant foods, so nuts, nut butters, and everything, and add them as much as possible. Baked goods, higher calorie density. It's all that calorie density stuff, but flipped on its head. So avocados, baked goods.
When you say baked goods, can you be a little more clear for those
Well,
who
like there's sort of whole food plant-based sort of muffin type of things,
Okay,
where it's
gotcha.
not a lot of added sugar, but you've got some raisins, you've got applesauce, you've got some peanut butter in there, and they can be, you find these things that can be pretty high calorie actually, even without oil and sugar, and those can be great. Coconut. I'm not a huge fan of coconut usually, but I've met people who are are clinically underweight, and that presents its own set of medical problems, and can very serious long-term risks. And so I'd rather have people kind of eat the very high calorie, even the stuff that may not be, I would consider optimal for like a heart disease patient, but like, add coconut, the full fat coconut milk, and nuts and so forth. So you can have a high calorie diet, um, you just need to plan it out and really emphasize those things while still eating, whole food plant-based.
Thank you very much. Coming back around to the question, and you did an excellent job of addressing this when it comes to added seed oils, but there has been a lot of talk in the media recently, news, that kind of thing, about beef tallow specifically. And this has come up numerous times here in questions this evening. So can you help someone to understand or be able to articulate to someone else why beef tallow may not be a better option than seed oils, or is that even a fair comparison to make?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's asking the health effects of two really specific things, and when you're asking about specific things, you always have to ask instead of what and with what. Seed oils, despite I'm not a fan of oils at all. So beef tallow, solid fats, beef tallow, and oils, avoid them all. Is the really brief answer. Avoid all of them. None of them are going to do you much good compared to whole foods. They're not good. Is one better than the other? Oh, well, seed oils, if actually historically, interestingly, if you look at this observational research, we just were talking about associations, but if you look at some of the observational research, there's actually some evidence that omega-6 fats, so omega-6 fats are an essential fatty acid. We've all heard, many of us have heard of omega-3 fats. These are anti-inflammatory. Omega-6 fats are the other essential amino acid. We don't hear about them very much because we eat gobs of them. There's no risk or shortage. And we largely get it from these oils, soybean oil, canola oil, other oils, that some of which are seed oils. Well, interestingly enough, if you look at some of the associations, it seems that diets that had higher omega-6 content and some of the heart disease literature had lower rates of heart disease. So there's been a lot of studies, for example, on associations where omega-6 intake has been positive, has been good, compared to particularly to saturated fat, which is, the beef tallow. So, there is some research out there to suggest that I'd rather stick with seed oils versus beef tallow, but it's all limited. There's a lot of limitations to this research, and it's always this question of, well, instead of what? Seed oil, this omega-6 fat has positive association, but does that just mean that these people, these are people eating a more Mediterranean style diet with some plant oils, so they have more omega-6, but they also have more fruits and vegetables, more physical activity, whatever. And this research can't answer that question. They don't go into those confounders and so forth when they do these large summary studies. So it's very hard to answer. The short answer is avoid both seed oils and beef tallow.
Okay. I have two other questions and then we'll wrap things up. One is around kind of blood testing. People always are kind of curious, like how often should I test for things like my B12 levels or my vitamin D levels, or should we test at all? And is that any different for people who are whole food plant-based than those who are eating an omnivorous
Yeah,
way?
I think it's worthwhile getting your B12 level checked if you're vegan or whole food plant-based. I think vegetarian, even if you're B12 level, and depending on your situation, if you're older adult, probably checking a little more frequently, once a year, once every couple of years, depending on how it's been, what you're supplementing with, et cetera. I mean, if you're one of these people who can't remember to take a supplement, and suddenly it's been 3 years since you have taken any B12 supplement, go get it checked. Um, but yeah, generally, and vitamin D, I don't recommend general screening for that. I do recommend, a small vitamin component, well, as part of a multivitamin most commonly. And really, you were talking about sunshine exposure with that, of course, and getting outside and getting some non-burning sunshine exposure is really important for your health. And there's some real major health benefits with that. So getting outside, getting some sunshine. But yeah, I do think, B12, there's people who get very anxious about lab tests and they want to check all sorts of things. And I think there's a phenomenon where it sort of provides some relief for a little bit and then the anxiety kind of comes back. And then one of those times, oh my God, if a little thing is abnormal, it's
Right.
relief if it's all normal. If it's something's a little abnormal, the anxiety goes through the roof. And it can be actually kind of a problem because some of these abnormals don't really mean very much. They don't do anything about them. So I don't. People can go get huge panels of stuff like on social media. Again, they keeps feeding me these ads for these testing panels where you get like 100 things tested. Your iron, maybe some B12 for vegans. B12 testing, I think, is reasonable. But that's about all. The others testing I only really do if there's a clinical indication. You have anemia, bone issues, et cetera.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. The last question that we'll end on is what about nuts? Because a lot of people, if they're, I heard you say earlier, to limit those added oils and things for people who have, chronic disease, heart disease, or something like that. But in general, just nuts, is that a really good food to be consuming if you're whole food plant-based? Should it be done in moderation? Kind of your thoughts on nuts as it pertains to whole food plant-based eating dietary patterns.
Yeah, personally, I think nuts are probably a healthy food. They are part of a healthy diet and tasty and delicious. The problem can rise, and when I'll speak with an individual with concern about nuts is if they're eating, if they're trying to lose weight and they can't, if they are if they're not getting some of the benefits of sort of a lower calorie intake that can come with a whole food plant-based diet. And you look online and my gosh, some of these recipes, every single thing has a half a cup of cashews and a cup of cashews in this and a cup of cashews over there. And they stick some peanut butter in the smoothie and suddenly these are very, very high calorie things and people probably are overeating some calories in some situations. And so in those situations, sometimes I'll say, let's stop the nuts. But for those people who don't have that clinical indication, they're not in those situations where I'm worried about the calorie intake. I think nuts are a healthy food.
Thank you very much for your time and for those answers.
Excellent. Tom, thank you so much. This has been a great evening with a lot of information. So thank you for spending time with us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Good. So on behalf of the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies, this has been Spotlight on Health. Watch your email inbox for our next Spotlight on Health. It's going to be in August. We're going to take a July off so you guys can take a vacation. And we'll meet back sometime in August. Just watch your email. So thank you for joining us tonight. And we'll see you in a couple months. Bye-bye.
Bye.